Welcome back. I'm Bill. Today I have a KampLite RL-3 lantern with me. These were made by the American Gas Machine Company in their factory in Albert Lea, Minnesota. From what I've been able to research, they were introduced in 1949 and they were made through 1953, possibly into 1954. We know they weren't made later than that because in 1954 AGM changed their KampLite lantern color scheme and they had red founts and black vents from that point for several years. In 1949, they kind of rebranded everything, so the lanterns were renamed KampLite. Before that, they were just sold under the name AGM or American Gas Machines. But this was to go along with their line of stoves, which were branded Camp Cook with a K, and their ice chests or coolers, which were Camp Cold, again with a K. So they had a whole lineup of camping equipment that all kind of went together. But this lantern is based on an earlier one. This is the 2572, and you've probably seen another video I did on these. It was a chrome-plated fount. These came in, as far as I know, 3 different color schemes. There was chrome, not nickel, but chrome with maroon, and then this one is maroon on bottom and maroon on top, and then there's one that's all green. The only difference between these two that I am aware of is that the 2572s have a brass fount and the RL-3 has a steel fount. This is good because AGM's brass founts are notorious for stress cracks. These are pretty common lanterns, thankfully. I've got 3, one in each of the color schemes that are all nice and that work great, but I've got a pile of stress-cracked founts that I went through in the process of putting some together that were actually good looking and that work. So we don't have to worry about with the KampLite. In fact, this holds pressure. I've already checked it. But these, again, dating's difficult. It was a post-war lantern. It was based on a lantern that was designed for military specs, which I've got an upcoming video on one of those. And all they did was redesign the collar a little bit and change the color scheme. So I've seen literature online that came with these. It's dated from June 1946, so they seem to have been introduced right after the war. They show up in catalogs and service manuals and parts lists in 1947, 1948, 1949. Because they're so common, you would think that they were made well into the 50s. But I suspect they were not. And if you know more about this, feel free to comment down below. But I suspect these were only made up through 1949-ish because the KampLite came out in 1949 and is virtually identical. And I mean, Coleman made models that were functionally equivalent concurrently, so maybe AGM did as well. Again, as common as these are, I would think they were made for more than 2 or 3 years. Whatever the case, this turned into this in 1949. They may have continued to make the 2572s, that's hard to say, but these were made definitely from 1949 to 1953, 1954. So, this is pretty much all original, as far as I can tell so far, except for the fuel cap. This is a modern Coleman single-piece fuel cap on here. Someone's replaced the original, which is too bad. The original would have looked like this. This is off of one of its younger brothers, a 2572 like this. These don't grow on trees though, so I may put this on just to show you later, but I'll end up painting this to match the rest of the lantern. That's not original, and the globe, actually see here, you probably can't see this on the camera, but it's got a Coleman Sunshine logo. So this is a period correct globe, but it's from a Coleman. The globe itself may actually be worth at least as much, if not more, than the lantern. We've got an AGM vent nut, which is nice, so the fount again is in solid condition. The paint is pretty rough. This one, especially since the collar's all right, I could probably just clean it up and leave it the way it is and polish it up. But I actually bought this to restore it. I even have a new decal for it. This is point out while we're looking at the decal. It's not just an RL-3, it was also the Scotsman, so presumably efficient on fuel. These were basically like a Coleman 220, and I actually think they burn a little bit brighter than the average 220, and they're really a nice lantern. If assuming this is anything like its older sibling, I actually haven't fired this up yet with mantles. I do know it works. It had gas in it and it pressurized, so I lit it without mantles. So I know it does run. But we're going to take this apart. I don't know what we'll find. Someone has taken this apart before, if you'll notice. It is not clocked properly. This is proper clocking. It's just sort of screwed in, however it got tight, I'm guessing. So we'll see what we find when we get in there, and some of these things are rusty. But let me adjust the camera for a better angle for your viewing, and we'll get into this. First things first, let's just take the vent off. I've got a bin over here for all my parts so they don't get lost. The vent's not perfect, but I think it should clean up pretty well. Set that globe aside. That's a nice globe. The first thing we want to do is get this generator off. And that should be a 7/16. Should be, oh, there we go. Sometimes this is when it's easier just to use an adjustable wrench. That's what I'm going to do because I don't feel like chewing that up any more than it already is. These AGM generators are very similar to 220 generators, and in fact you can interchange them if necessary because of course AGM generators haven't been made in a very long time. We'll slide that nut up. That's very sooty. Okay, the whole generator's sliding up. And I'll turn this so you can see the difference between this and a Coleman generator is that it's got a little claw here. And actually this looks like someone used a 220 pricker in there, which is what I was going to explain. The AGM cleaning rods, yep, that's a 220, definitely a 220 cleaning rod. This has a little claw here, and the AGM cleaning rods are just straight, and then they have a recessed part, like a notch at the bottom that fits into this claw. So you can use a 220 generator or cleaning tip. It's just where it's curved down here at the bottom, it'll extend out too far and won't slip down into the valve body. So you'll need to file or grind off this part. And I found in the past, I actually think this guy here has the same setup. Often you'll have to grind down the back part here where the 220 generator bulges out. And you'll also have to file or flatten both sides here so that it fits in the claw. But the 220 generator, the tip orifice and all that, the length, it's all the same size. So when we get this cleaned up, we may find that this is actually, boy, that really doesn't want to come off. There we go. And if we look at the, I have to take my glasses off to see this. We can look, yeah, there's a little V stamped on there. So this is, that's what you would find on a Coleman 220 generator. Just an encouraging note, if you work on one of these and you're missing a generator, or your generator's damaged, 220 generators are easy to get. And I'll post a link up above to my video on how to service, restore, clean generators that are all clogged up. But this generator isn't clogged up, but I would like to make sure it's clean before we do anything more with it. So now we want to unscrew, let's see, we want to unscrew this guy down here. There's a retaining nut on the valve, and that will allow us to lift things up and out of the way. This is a 9/16. We need to get underneath here. Sorry to block your view. All right, now we'll just lift that nut up, set it aside. All right, now we can lift this up. And once it's up, we can just kind of hang it, because hopefully you can see there's a little screw here. We need to get that guy out. Usually they're not a problem, but sometimes they can be stuck. So if it doesn't want to unscrew, make sure your fount's got no fuel in it and that it's dry. And then take a propane torch and just apply a little bit of heat to that, and it should come right out. This is the equivalent of that little set screw deal on the back of a 220 air tube. And once that's off, just unscrew, and usually on these, again, this is the first time I've taken apart a KampLite, but the AGM version, these air tubes usually come out quite easily. They don't have a lot of threads going in, and they're that's not a spot that's going to typically get a bunch of crud in it or rust or anything like that. So I want to take the air tubes off, or the burner tubes off rather, to get them clean. So in this case, if I can't get these off, I'm going to do my best to get them off. If I can't, it's not the end of the world, because I do know there's nothing obstructing it, but I really would like to clean it, and it's easier to get everything cleaned and polished up if you can get it all apart. So I'll try that later. Try to heat and quench it. So at this point, our burner frame just lifts right up. Set that aside. The collar tips like that. And I want to make note of how the badge is located on there. And it's just held on with these tabs. And since I want to clean this, and I will be repainting this lantern. I know some people will say it's not that bad, but I actually bought it for the purpose of doing a full restoration on it. So I will be repainting. So I need to get this badge off, and it's just got these little tabs. And it comes off just like that. And that's our collar. For an AGM collar, it's actually in pretty nice shape. Fuel cap off. Ah, yes. Someone has been in here before. I didn't expect that, but it shouldn't surprise me. AGM founts have, the bung has a hex on it. So you put a wrench on it before you screw the valve out. Lots of people don't bother with that. They just try to take the valve out, and you can guess what happens. You end up spinning the bung. So someone has welded this one back in place. But at least they did a good job, but that explains why things aren't clocked properly. So let's take the pump out. Usually these have a screw on the top and the bottom, but the one on the bottom's missing here. Oh boy, we'll need to straighten that too, although it's not a functional issue because these don't have an air stem like a Coleman. Paper towel here, because this is all nice and oily. The pump leather is definitely good. I do want to get this all apart so I can clean it, and so it's easier to straighten that out. Usually this happens because on an AGM check valve, unlike a Coleman where there's an air stem, this flattened part locks into the check valve, and when you screw it and unscrew it, it actually opens and closes the check valve. So what happens is someone comes along and they just pull this out and try to start pumping without opening the check valve by unscrewing it, and the air won't go in, and so they push harder and harder and harder to get the air in, and of course the check valve is sealed shut, and they end up bending the soft brass body. Let's see, this is oily enough, but it won't. So I'm going to hold this with my pliers. And it's nice and tight. There we go. All right. Retaining nut. There's a washer in here. And then this just unscrews. Usually these are a lot more difficult to get off. And then we can just lift our springy cap off. And now, yeah, we can straighten that more easily. Okay, the valve. Let's get the whole valve out first. I don't think it's welded up, so I don't think it's going to spin loose. And let's see if I can even get some pliers or a wrench on it to hold it. I don't think I'll be able to because of all that welding, but there might be a couple of flat surfaces on there. So the bung is 3/4 of an inch. Let's get the tip cleaner out of the way, and maybe, and actually the good sign is it looks like there's Teflon tape on there, so that hopefully will make it easier. All right, I actually do have something to grip there. I'm just going to take a large adjustable wrench and put it on there. Not getting much of a bite, I guess. Okay, let's try this again. Let's see if that's loose enough. I don't think it's going to break loose at this point. Here we go. Okay. So there's our Fount. Yeah, AGMs, if someone's had it apart, it's usually because they had to solder that bung or weld that bung back in place. Okay. Let's get the valve stem out. And that should, this packing nut should be a 1/2 inch. Just unscrew that. And boy, that all looks nice. The seat looks good, so it shouldn't leak. Our graphite packing looks great, so yeah, all I'm going to do is clean up the knob and the packing nut, and I think we'll call that good. And now the valve, we want to take off this screen, this mesh. I'll show you. This was the gas that was in there. It's been sitting here for maybe 30 minutes. You can see all that gunk down at the bottom. When I poured it out, it was suspended in there. It's slowly settling out, and I'm going to let it settle out, and by the time we're done, it should be good, and we can just pour this gas back in through a filter. But with all that crud in there, it means that this brass screen is going to be pretty clogged up. So I want to take that off. There's a wire around here, and we just need to grab that wire with some pliers. Find the end of it first. Sometimes they just break. And if this brass mesh gets damaged, or if the wire gets, I mean, you could replace the wire pretty easily. But if this mesh gets damaged, as long as your fount is clean when you're done, you shouldn't need this. So if you can't, if you damage it, or if maybe it's missing when you take it apart, it'll be okay without this as long as your fount doesn't have any sediment in it. Modern fuel is clean, and these generally aren't necessary anymore. The reason for that screen is this itty bitty tiny orifice. This is kind of like a Coleman 220 or 228 slant. It's got a tiny little orifice there to pick up fuel. So you can imagine with all that crud floating around in the fount, just how easy it would be for that little hole to get clogged up. So this will unscrew. At any rate, it should. If you're taking it apart this far, you want to take that off so that you can make sure it's clean. That one's tight. Usually once it breaks free, you can just unscrew it. So that's our fuel pickup. The rest of this I'm going to leave. This is soldered in place. This is where the fuel goes in. This is where the air goes in for its equivalent to its instant lighting circuit. So I'm not sure what somebody has done here. This is kind of munged up. There's usually a little nub there. And we'll take off the tip cleaner. Again, this is kind of like on a 220, and be careful that you don't end up bracing yourself against that fuel pickup and snapping it off. So this is kind of like say a Coleman 220 or 200 cleaning lever. There's a graphite packing inside that first nut, but it's not really user serviceable. So we'll just take this whole thing off and we'll slide our eccentric block out. Remember, when we put it back in, the claw faces the lever. And the last thing on the valve, and sometimes these require some heat to get off, but there's a clean out here. And this is where the spring is for the these oftentimes, I think that's going to require some heat. I'll show you later. There's a little spring and sort of a metal pit in there, and that's how the air is metered for the lighting circuit so that it doesn't flood. But these get really stuck in there, and it takes a little heat to get it out. So I'll show you once it's out. And that's everything. So first step is to just wash with soap and water the parts that need to be washed with soap and water. And then I'll take the brass and the steel parts and put them in a big pot of citric acid on the stove and let them boil away, and that will get rid of rust. And we also need to strip some paint. Let's wash some parts, just the soap and water bits. I'm going to use Simple Green. This is a good cleaner. It removes grease as well, so I'm just going to spray it on the vent. It also is good on sooty undersides of vents. And I know we're going to strip this. You can see it's all rusty on top. I'm going to strip that, but I'll clean it anyways. Maybe that'll make it easier. Rinse this out. Oh yeah, we're going to have to put some citric acid in here. Do a BB shake. None of this is terrible. Some of this may actually be crud some fuel as well. Okay. Just going to set this down here for now. Put a funnel in. And I'm just taking some of these BBs. And I put a bunch of them in there. That should be plenty. And I don't want that going down the drain. Put that guy in there too. And now you shake it. And you're not going to want to hear this. So I'm going to do that for the next 10 minutes or so and make sure that everything in there is broken loose, and then I'll be back and we'll shake these out and rinse it out until it runs clean. Alright, you can hear that in there. I've been shaking this around for about 10 minutes. It's really obnoxious. If you do this, do it when no one else is around. I know some of you always caution me about stuff going down the sink. I've never had a problem with that, but when I'm putting BBs into shaking them out of a fountain, yeah, I will plug the drain. And we'll just shake the BBs out. We'll set those aside, unplug our drain. And now let's see what awful things come out. Now see, that's really interesting. We were still getting big black chunks out of there before I put the BBs in. I think perhaps the BBs just broke things up. That's good though. The BBs will break loose any rust flakes, things like that are stuck on the base or on the walls of the fount. But this is good, so I'm happy with that. There's still a little bit of sediment in there, but once I've stripped this, I'm going to put this in a big pot of citric acid and boil out the inside and make sure we get rid of any rust on the outside as well. So I'm not too worried about any sediment that's left in there. So let's put all the other stuff in citric acid before we get to that. So here we are with our lantern soup again. This is citric acid solution. I use about 1 teaspoon of citric acid powder per liter of water. I am using this product, which I get at a beer and wine making supply house. I think it's about $8 for a kilo. So a liter of water, teaspoon of citric acid, and I've got the brass part, mostly brass parts in here. A couple things I thought were brass turned out to be steel. I think it's ideal if you can keep those separated. And then over here in the big pot, I've got the burner cage and the burner assembly and a few other steel parts. The burner cage is awkward because the handle, the bail won't all go in, but we'll do that in sections. The burner tubes I tried heating and quenching multiple times and they did not want to come loose, and the burner caps also are almost sort of crumbly. So I think there's a lot of rust on there, so I'm not going to take it apart. I know the airflow is good, so I'm just going to let it de-rust in the citric acid solution, and I will clean it as best I can with some round brushes and some steel wool, and it should be just fine. So when this is done, we will clean all these with steel wool. Now let's use some 4/0 fine steel wool and rub down all these pieces that just came out of the citric acid. Side. The pump tube. I'm sorry, I neglected to show you, I neglected to turn the camera on when I was straightening that out, but all I did was I wrapped some cardboard around it and put it in my bench vise, rotating it various ways until it was straight. It's not quite perfect, it's got a slight bend here, but it's fine and it'll work just great. This should be nickel plated, but you can tell it's worn off over the years. And here's our tip cleaner assembly. Now, this was steel. I knew the handle was steel. I didn't expect the rest of it to be within with our brass, but that's okay. Oh, actually, I was right. That is brass. It just doesn't look like it. It's very black. And someone flooded this lantern a lot. There's lots of carbon under the burner cage down inside the collar. I won't show you everything here, but that gives you an idea. And once I'm done with these small parts, the burner cage isn't quite ready yet. But one of the things we'll show you, the generator. So that's all nice and shiny on the outside now. But more importantly, let's clean the inside. So I've got these round brushes. You see there's a set. You can buy these for a couple of dollars from Amazon or AliExpress. And these are great for getting inside and removing the carbon, which is softened and broken up by the citric acid. So make sure our generator isn't getting clogged up by debris inside there. There you see. So I'll come back to you when I'm done. Alright, let's polish some of this stuff up. Before I do that, the burner assembly with the burner tubes, air tube, manifold, all that, I did use a wire wheel on this. This was not going to come apart. I heated and quenched a bunch, and this did not want to break free. And these burner caps are getting very brittle. You can see where some of the outer layer has flaked off. So I think this is about as good as it's going to get. So I'm going to polish up this part down here and leave it at that. So I'm using a cotton buffing wheel and this number 5 compound, of which looks like I need to get some more. Pump tube. It's got little marks on there. I think we can polish those off. Now this should not be just polished brass, it should be plated, but the plating gone, we'll just have to live with it. when I'm done.
Now, let's strip this fount. I was originally going to use paint stripper on this, but after seeing how crusty it is, I'm going to use a wire wheel. That will help get the rust off, and it will hopefully smooth some of the stuff out, so I'll have to do less sanding later. I've had really good luck using this on things like my AGM Sunflame video a while back, and I know some of you guys made some comments about using the wire wheel for that, but it actually helps and does a good job when you're dealing with some of the surface rust. It's kind of messy, so I've put on an old coat with long sleeves, got my gloves, I'm wearing a respirator, and I'll start taking this off. So that gives you an idea. It's going to take a little bit, but you know, this doesn't take any more time than using paint stripper does, and I think it helps get some of the work done that I'll have to do later with sandpaper. But this will take care of some of it. But yeah, I'm guessing this fount's probably not going to be perfect. One nice thing with the brass founts is they're smooth after you take the paint off. The steel, once they rust, they kind of get rough. But I'll see what I can do with sanding. So I'm going to continue with this and show you some little bits, but otherwise I'll see you when I'm done.
And here's the top. Let's get to work on the sides. Alright, we're almost all the way around. Last for the deco.
The fount's been stripped, and I soaked it in citric acid. Water is coming out clean, so the inside is good. The wire wheel that I used to take the paint off actually did a pretty good job getting a lot of the rust off and everything, and then soaking in citric acid for the last couple hours has helped that a lot too. But they're still pitting. I was kind of hoping I might be able to just hit this with one coat of the top coat and not have to worry about primer, because I've actually had good luck with this stuff lately, just spraying on directly onto the metal, and it even says it doesn't need primer, and as it turns out it doesn't seem to, but I have a feeling I'm going to need to primer this and then sand it. But I'm going to start out with some 150 grit, which is pretty rough, but I'm going to see what I can do. The part inside the collar here I'm not really worried about. That's never going to be smooth, but I'll still see what I can do with this. If we can get it a little bit better, that'd be nice. But there's around the collar, just on the outside, it's pretty rough too. So if I can knock some of this down. Actually, that's helping. This I'm not that worried about because you won't see this inside the collar, but there's a bit of roughness around the rim, and on the side of the fount there are some rough spots too. So that's the main thing. I want to see if I can smooth that stuff out. Here it is, all sanded with the 400 grit. I actually think that came out really nicely. I'm not feeling the high spots, the rough spots anymore, so they're still pitting.
So my next step, I'm going to use some 400, or sorry, this was 150 grit. I'm going to use some 400 grit and wet sand just a little bit, just to smooth it out a bit for some primer. $600 might be better, but I just realized I'm all out of 600 grit. All right, I think I'm going to call that good. We'll just wipe this down. Yeah, that feels nice. I think the primer will fill the voids and make it a better looking fount than I thought we would when I got this started. So, right, time for primer. Okay, let's spray some paint. I've got it hanging. I've got some ventilation. I'm going to put my respirator on here in a minute. I'm going to be using this trim-clad gray. I've used this in the past. It's good paint. Probably 2 coats. I'm going to put on 1 thin coat just to cover the metal and then come back in 5 to 10 minutes and put another coat on. We'll see where we go from there. All right, that looks good. We'll let that sit for 5 minutes and maybe 10 and then come back and hit it with another coat. Let's go for a second coat.
All right, there we go.
Well, here's our primer. It's cured. It looks pretty good, but I'm going to wet sand it with some 1000 grit because there are low spots. There's one spot somewhere here. I got some dust or lint or something right here in the paint. But I have a feeling this is going to turn out better than I had anticipated. Okay, that I think is going to be a nice primer coat. Seems very smooth. Yeah, I think the rim's the only spot, and of course up here, still got some issues, but that was some pretty bad rust. So while we're at it, let's wet sand the collar. All right, let it dry a little bit and we'll be ready for our top coat. It's time for our top coat. So I am using this trim-clad Wild Raspberry. It is a perfect match for AGM's 1940s burgundy. So this is shaken up. Let me get my mask on and we'll be ready to paint. Well, sometimes you have setbacks. As you can see, things didn't go as planned with the color coat on this. I'm using this trim-clad Wild Raspberry. I've never had any problems with trim-clad paint. I like it. I've used this exact color on a number of other lanterns. In fact, it's what I used to paint this a couple years ago. The Wild Raspberry is as perfect a match as you could ask for the 1940s AGM burgundy. And so last night I had everything set up. The priming was done. Went to spray this, and I sprayed on a piece of cardboard first just to make sure that paint wasn't spitting or splattering. I've had that with Rust-Oleum before. So I just gave it a test, and I noticed that the paint came out with hardly any pigment. In fact, this color is a good example. It was almost like a tinted clear coat. So I figured this wasn't mixed well enough, so I did put it in a bowl of hot water for about 25 minutes to get it warmed up. And then I shook it for 7 minutes just to make sure it was really mixed. And I did a test spray on the cardboard again, and it looked better. So I went ahead and started painting the fount, and I was trying to put on a light coat, and I was judging. Normally I would judge that by how much color was showing up on the fount and covering the primer. And I wouldn't expect it to cover in that first coat anyways, but I got once or halfway around and around the other side, and when I got back, I noticed there are these sags in the paint. Great, it went on too thickly, and it wasn't putting down much color. It was better than the test strip I did on the cardboard. I tried the collar as well, and well, you can see there's not much color on it. And what's weird is it sagged as well, but yet when you touch this, you can't feel anything raised. The same thing here. I can't feel a darn thing. It's like the paint is smooth, but the pigment just ran. So I think I've got a dud can here. Again, I've never had this happen. The other thing I noticed is you can see how, I hope on the camera you can see how glossy this is compared to this. This is gloss. This is what it should look like. It's like the paint came out without the pigment here. So I don't know what's going on other than I'm sure I've got a bad can. So I am going to return this to the store from whence I got it, and I'm going to get a can. Hopefully it'll work. And in the meantime, the collar's fine. It just needs more paint on it. So I'm not too worried about this. The Fount, I am going to wet sand this a little bit, even though all these sags, it's like it's pigment, not the paint itself that somehow ran. And I did last night, after I discovered this was happening, I did shake this some more, a lot more, and played around with it on some cardboard, and I noticed the pigment just doesn't come out consistently, which probably explains why I've got a light spot here, which is more of what I would expect, and then suddenly it's darker through here. But wherever the pigment came through more thick, the pigment like ran within the paint. So that's a weird one. Some of you guys probably know paint better than I do. I'm no expert on it. But I'm going to do a little bit of wet sanding on this, and I'll see you when I'm ready to spray again and have a good can of paint. Got a fresh can of paint. It's all shaken up. I've done a few test sprays with it, and it's looking good. So here goes nothing. That's doing much better. So I'll let that sit for about between 5 and 10 minutes and come back for a second coat. Okay, on to coat number 2. This is looking much better. And coat number 3, I think this will be the last. Things are looking really nice here. We're ready to put this all back together. The Fount turned out spectacular. Initially I didn't expect it to be as rough as it was, but then once I washed it and realized how rusty it was, I did not expect our finished product would be this nice. We've got some blobs up here from where the bung was soldered or welded back in place, but apart from that, everything
it's just beautiful. All that pitting and everything is filled in, and even with that snafu with the bad paint can, we got past that and everything's looking good. So I actually did paint the fuel cap that came with this, but for now, let's put on a proper fuel cap. This is what it would have come with. This is actually an AGM fuel cap off of another KampLite from a similar era. And let's put our pump together next. Got our pump tube, our cap, our stop, the washer, and the pump leather with its washer there. So, oh, and we need a little spring. There's our spring. So we'll put the cap on, and then the spring, and then our stop. And I'm just going to make sure this is tight. If your pump comes loose inside there, it's a pain. Everything ends up stuck down in the bottom. Put our pump cup on. And the little washer. And we'll tighten that down as well. And our pump cup is in good shape. I'm going to oil it. I like using this 3-in-1 oil. Any oil that's not vegetable based will do. If you're out camping and you have an emergency, you can even use the oil from your dipstick in your car or truck. I have done that before. And pull up any excess. And down we go. Now, you may notice I did not remove the check valve on this lantern. The check valve, oops, this is what happens when you repaint. Sometimes it gets a little bit thick on the pump tube. There we go. I did not remove the check valve because it was holding pressure. These are actually, in some ways, easier to remove than a Coleman. A Coleman, you really need a special tool to do it. On these AGMs, this is actually what I have this large screwdriver for. It's got a slot in it, so you need to put the pump in first and make sure that you lock the center down, or the center will project out and you can't get a screwdriver in it. But you can use a large screwdriver, make sure it's got a good bite, and oops, we're magnetized. Make sure you've got a good bite on it, and they usually come out pretty easily. Right, and this was missing the bottom screw, but that's all right. It'll survive without that. So, yeah, all right. Now, let's put our valve together. Got the valve itself. Now, if you're curious about the workings of these valves, I've got a video. It isn't done yet, but by the time this video goes up, that video should be up first. But I've got a video on the theory of operation and the internal guts of these AGM valves, because while they do the same thing that the Coleman instant light valves do, they do it a bit differently. So if that video's up, I'll put a link up above. You can check that out. I've got the valve body, the tip cleaner, our valve stem. I don't know what that part's called, that little guy. Our screen, the wire to hold the screen on, and our fuel pickup tip, and somewhere there's a spring here. There it is. Our little air supply pip, and our eccentric block. A few more parts than on a Coleman. So first, I'm going to take this little pip. This controls air. the airflow when it's being lit. And we'll just drop that. Let's see. That goes down in there, and we'll just drop it in. And then this spring goes on top of that. And then this guy, I don't know why they don't seem to, these are always steel, and this is always brass, or maybe it's bronze from the color. They never unscrew on their own. You always have to apply heat, and yet there doesn't actually seem to be anything on them. So I'm not really sure what's up with that. We want that good and tight. And we'll put our pickup tip on. When I cleaned this, I made sure I took the cleaning rod from the generator and poked the needle through that hole to make sure it was clear. Make sure this is nice and snug so that it doesn't fall off in the bottom of the fount. Now at this point, if your fount is clean, there's no debris or little bits of anything in there, and you're using good clean fuel, you're probably okay. It's unlikely this will clog. Back in the day when people used to siphon gas out of their cars to put in these, you could have problems, and that's why they had to put screens on these, just like on the slants. Coleman's design was more forgiving. And then okay, so you want to feel that wire fall into the groove, and then once it's in there, we will just pinch it shut. Squish it down. Sometimes when you put these in, they get hung up in the bung and they'll tear as well, so you need to be careful about that. Now the tip cleaner. The tip cleaner goes in here. And we'll start it and then drop the eccentric block in. You see this notch? That notch needs to be facing the actuator. And hopefully as this screws in, it will catch it, and you'll start to see it go up and down. There we go. Again, when you're doing this, make sure you don't brace yourself on the fuel pickup, because you don't want to snap that off. And our valve stem. Screw the valve stem all the way in first, then screw the packing nut down. Oops. Too much. That's too little. These can be, the graphite packing can be kind of finicky on these. The thing to check is, and once it gets warm, it will usually loosen up a little bit too. You can check when it's running. If you've got run your finger down here, if you get any fuel residue on it, it'll be kind of black because of the packing. If you've got any fuel residue there, just tighten the nut a little bit. It's easy because it's exposed. And do that until it doesn't leak anymore, or if it's too hard to turn, back it off just a little bit. Sometimes they can be touchy, and yeah. So these are brass on brass and it's a tapered thread, so you, in theory, shouldn't need any sealant or thread locker on there. They did use it from the factory. At least Coleman did. I think AGM did as well. But especially because I don't know if this bung is oriented the way it should be, because someone spun it out and then soldered it back in place. It may not be oriented properly. So since I want to get this clocked right with the valve stem pointing out halfway between these two, I'm going to use some thread sealant on here just in case I have trouble getting it as snug as I would prefer. And I use this Permatex blue because it'll let me take it out if I need to at some point in time. If you use the red, that stuff's more or less, I think it's just intended to be permanent. So carefully. There we go. There's still, and that thread sealant actually works as kind of a lubricant to a certain extent. But no, that's why. This is why we need the thread sealant. Because it's not going to turn as far as it needs to without over tightening it, and that bung is not going to handle being over tightened. So this is as far as we can go, but that thread sealant will make sure that it doesn't leak and will hold it tight. So I'm just going to play with this a little bit and make sure it's halfway. I think that's about it. So I wish it were tighter, but again, that's what the thread sealant's for. And I can see I've got plenty coming out there, so we should be good. Right, next is the collar. The collar has this notch for the cleaning lever, and then this cutout for the valve stem. So it goes on like that. But we need to put the badge back on first. So it's just got these bendable tabs on the back side. So that goes in like that. Oh, no, it goes one over. There we go. And that's soft aluminum. All right. Next, we need to get the burner cage on here. We've got a hole in the middle for the valve and this back hole for the burner tube. So we'll just get this on here because we need to get the burner tube in first before we do anything else with that burner cage. Once the burner tube is in, we want to make sure it's lined up with how the generator is going to go. So that's perfect right there. And now we've got a little screw that needs to go in the side, which is why I didn't screw down the burner tube yet. So hopefully I can do this in a way that you can see. It's not like a Coleman 220 where you have to have a hole lined up. You just get the burner tube in tight. Okay, now once we've got that, this nut is what holds everything together. That's a 9/16. This is lined up with the valve, so we're all good there. Now, our generator, again, this is a 220 generator. We've got the 220 guts here. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in first. And then, actually, I'll put the cleaning rod in first so we don't accidentally snag our cleaning needle. And then the tip. I'm going to push that all the way up just to make sure that when I put this on, it's going over the needle. Tight. And then we'll let that guy drop back out, and it kind of goes in sideways into that claw. If you can see it. Let me use some pliers to help you see here. Of course, I need to rotate it first. Okay, see how there's that claw there. I'm going to slide this in, rotate this down. I think it's actually going in all the way. Yeah, I'm sorry you can't see, but I've got to do it with my finger. And we'll rotate down. That 7/16 still doesn't quite want to fit. Can't see if the tip cleaner is going up and down properly, but I can rotate this and see if I feel any binding anywhere. I can actually feel a slight binding just as it goes to the very bottom, but that's just the tip of the hook, and it's got a little bit of a tight fit on as it goes down into the valve. You have to shave that part off to get it to fit right. So let's tie a couple of mantles on here. We use these Peerless 2CHGs. They are the Peerless equivalent to a Coleman number 21, and they're the same size as, off the top of my head right now, I'm not remembering what the AGM mantle brand was, but they're the same size as the 21s. So put a little tie in at first. Get it up here over the burner cap. Trying to spread out some of these gatherings. When you tie mantles on, they'll be kind of flat. Have the flat side facing the generator, and always snip the leftover ties off. If those curl down, they can damage the mantle. This is a pain. Let's turn this back. All right. Load back in. And there's one last thing to do. I've got a new decal for this, and it goes right here. So take my gloves off so that I've got clean hands. This is not a water slide decal like the original. I think you could probably make a water slide decal if you really wanted to. A little bit of a spot there, but that's good. All right. So now I will fill it with fuel and burn the mantles in, and I thought I'd just show you. This is that nasty fuel that came out of there. I poured it into this measuring cup, and you can see I let it sit for several hours, and all the crud that was in there, most of it settled to the bottom. I decanted that into this jar, and this jar has been sitting for a couple days. There's a very little bit of sediment down on the bottom, but that's all right. I'll pour this through a filter funnel. But Coleman fuel doesn't really go bad. I think when the apocalypse comes, it'll be Coleman fuel and cockroaches left afterwards. But yeah, the fuel's just fine, so I'm going to reuse that. So with the magic of video editing, I'll be back in just a brief second for you, and this will be ready to light. Welcome back. We are gassed up. We are pumped up. I've put about 35 pumps into the fount. The mantles are burned in, and this thing is ready to light. Now, I've brought out its two older siblings to watch. The 2572, which was made 46 to 49, maybe a little bit later. This was the immediate predecessor to the RL-3. And really the only difference is this has a brass fount and this has a steel fount. But I also brought out this 3927. This was a military lantern made by AGM during World War II, made for the US military, but also made for essential civilian production. So there's no way to know really if it was actually a military lantern or just a wartime lantern. But this, aside from the collar and the vent, which are a little different than these guys, the 3927 uses all the same internals. It's got the same valve, it's got the same burner, same pump style, all of that. So this was the immediate predecessor to the 2572. So because the fuel system in this was bone dry, before I light it, I want to make sure I'm not sticking a match up there and just having it go out. So I'm going to crack the valve and wait for the hiss to turn to a sputter, and that tells me that fuel is getting to the generator and it's ready to light. All right, there we go. Sometimes first light ups are... Oh. Let's try that again. Actually, if this is going to be this way, I'm going to go ahead and try the barbecue lighter. Just, it's a little easier. ready to go now. That's probably the trickiest light up I've had in a while, but sometimes that happens when you've just torn everything apart. Let's open the valve all the way. On AGMs, you need to open the valve all the way. If you forget, you'll drain all the air out of the top of the fount and lose pressure. So add a little more pressure. And these mantles aren't quite as bright as I would like, but these are some new peerless ones, and my observation with these new peerless ones is, I don't know why, I've never seen it with other mantles, but they take a good 5 minutes or so to burn in, and then they run really nice and bright. In fact, you can already see they're starting to brighten up. So I'm going to let this run for a few minutes, and we'll be back. Yep. As expected, 5 minutes later, the mantles have brightened up. It's running beautifully. So I'm really happy with this one. Let me cut the lights. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.